quand on fait défiler.
They managed to distort history by using this rhetoric, including the history of Africa. They could pass off lies as the truth, leading to some young Africans not knowing Africa's history. My biggest regret is having spent a good part of my youth listening to radios like RFI, France 24. I've been living in countries where these radios were the only ones. We would use the programs, record their news to listen to, but after a while, there was a click. I began to understand that they brainwash us.
My people, one African leader just did what most wouldn't dare. He looked President Donald Trump straight in the eye and said, no. No to being used, no to being disrespected, and no to turning Africa into the world dumping ground. That leader is Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. And what he just did could change everything. Because while other African governments are quietly signing Trump's third country deportation deals, agreeing to take in deportees and refugees from the U.S. for a check or a few diplomatic favors, Traoré said, not here, not us. And Washington's response, a visa ban, punishment. Burkina Faso citizens now blocked from traveling to America. All because one African leader dared to say no. Now this moment could rewrite history. What we're witnessing right now in Burkina Faso is not just a political move. It's a shift in consciousness. Because for the first time in a long time, a leader didn't just talk about sovereignty. He acted on it. He reminded the world that Africa is not desperate, that Africa is not waiting to be rescued, that Africa has the right to say no and mean it. And yes, the U.S. has power. Yes, the consequences will sting. But power has never really been about might, has it? It's about mindset. And when that mindset changes, everything else follows. So today we're breaking down, who is Ibrahim Traoré? Why did he reject Trump's deal? And what could this defiance mean for the future of Africa and its relationship with the United States? This is the breakdown.
We are striving to collaborate more with all the countries that are fighting today for their economic independence, because it is a form of imperialist oppression. Those who are oppressed should unite to face this hegemony, and have achieved some progress in this field. There are many agencies to be put in place, there are many aspects to be leveled in the three countries, since, I believe you are aware, our economic levels vary. Militarily, there are many aspects. Balance is crucial, and therefore, it requires the implementation of many systems, many meetings. And free movement requires a certain number of factors to be combined.
So who is Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the man at the center of all this? Well, he's not your typical African president. He's 37 years old, the youngest head of state in the world, and he came to power in 2022 after a coup that promised to restore security, sovereignty, and pride to Burkina Faso. Now, a lot of Western media like to label him as anti-West, pro-Russia, or authoritarian. But if you listen closely to what he actually says, his message isn't about ideology. It's about independence. It's about Africa reclaiming its voice in a world that still treats it like a junior partner. Now, Traoré speaks the language of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader who once ruled the same country and said, "He who feeds you controls you." That's the spirit Traoré channels. And that's exactly why this moment, his defiance of Trump and Washington, is so symbolic. Because the U.S. wasn't just asking Burkina Faso to take back its own citizens. Under Trump's new third country deportation policy, Washington wanted to send people from other countries, refugees and migrants from Latin America and Asia, to African soil. Basically saying, you take them, we'll pay you. And Traoré's government said, no. His foreign minister called the U.S.'s proposal indecent and unworthy, saying Burkina Faso is not a land of deportation. Now let that sink in. A small landlocked African nation, one of the poorest in the world, standing up to the most powerful country on earth and doing it in the name of dignity. And that's why this story hits so hard, because this isn't just about migration. It's about the terms of partnership. You see, the U.S. loves to talk about democracy and cooperation in Africa until a country actually exercises its democratic right to say no. Then suddenly it's visa suspensions, aid reviews, and security reevaluations. In other words, punishment. But for Traoré, this wasn't a negotiation. It was a matter of principle. Burkina Faso has already kicked out French troops, cut ties with Paris, and formed the alliance of Sahel states with Mali and Niger, countries that are also distancing themselves from Western control. So when Washington came knocking with its deportation deal, Traoré's answer was simple. We've already decided to take our destiny into our own hands. And just like that, Burkina Faso became one of the first African countries to reject America's migrant deal outright. That's not just policy. That's a statement, a line in the sand that says Africa can't be bought. Not anymore.
Supreme Court has cleared the way for deportations to third countries. Their decision grants President Trump's emergency request to send migrants to countries other than their nations of origin with minimal notice. The Department of Homeland Security is celebrating the decision, saying in part the Supreme Court ruling is a victory for the safety and security of the American people. Fire up the deportation planes. The decision pauses a lower court ruling from a Boston judge back in May. He said the government's actions lacked due process and violated the Constitution, blocking a flight with 8 migrants convicted of serious crimes from Myanmar, Vietnam, and Cuba headed for South Sudan. The White House vowed to fight the decision.
President Trump promised to get vicious, illegal alien murderers, rapists, and pedophiles like these out of our country. These judicial activists want to unilaterally stop President Trump from deporting foreign terrorists and keeping the American people safe. We hope the Supreme Court will continue to rein this in as soon as possible to restore proper constitutional order in our country.
Justice Sonia Sotomayor, joined by 2 other liberal justices, issued a dissent saying the court was, quote, rewarding lawlessness and that the government's misconduct threatens the bedrock of the rule of law. The High Court gave no explanation for the ruling.
So let's talk about this deportation deal, because this is where the real story begins. You see, Trump's third country deportation plan sounds technical, but it's actually one of the most controversial and exploitative migration policies in the world. And here's how it works. Instead of sending deported migrants back to their home countries, the U.S. signs secret migration cooperation deals with other nations and then pays them to take in people who aren't even their citizens. That's right. Refugees from Latin America and Asia are being offered up to African nations under the label of partnership. So they come with a smile and say, oh, take them and we'll pay you. But here's the thing. What they don't say is, if you don't take them, we'll ban you, or there will be consequences. And that's exactly what just happened. Burkina Faso said no, and the U.S. slammed the door. Visa ban, punishment, no more travel, no more access. Let's call it what it is. That's not diplomacy, right? That's coercion. It's the kind of power move that's dressed up as cooperation, but underneath, it's just control. Because if it were truly voluntary, then saying no shouldn't come with a price. But clearly it does. Now let's be clear. Burkina Faso isn't the first country to say no. Nigeria also did. But this is the first time that we're seeing a clear correlation between no and retaliation from the U.S. But other nations like Rwanda, Ghana, Eswatini, and South Sudan have already signed similar deals quietly, with almost no public debate, no parliamentary vote, no national consultation, because it's all done behind closed doors in the language of aid, support, and security cooperation. But the truth is, it's outsourced deportation. The U.S. is exporting its immigration crisis to Africa, treating the continent like a backup plan, or worse, a dumping ground. And that's what makes Ibrahim Traoré's no so important. Because in that one word, he exposed the entire system. He revealed what these deals really are. Not migration partnerships, but power tests. And for once, Africa didn't flinch. Think about it. If Burkina Faso, a small landlocked country with limited resources, can stand its ground even in the face of consequences and retaliation, what excuse do the bigger nations have? Because let's be honest, this isn't about ability. It's about will. The will to say no, even when it costs you something. And that, my people, is exactly what we've been missing.
I think people are quite aware of their goals. They manage to distort history by using this rhetoric, including the history of Africa. They could pass off lies as the truth, leading to some young Africans not knowing Africa's history. What has Africa done? Some don't even know that our grandparents fought, being used as cannon fodder, and in return, killed like animals. Do people know that when France experimented with its first atomic bomb, it was black soldiers who were placed in the lethal radius to see what effect it had? It's all in the archives. Everything they used against Africa is terrible. So there is all this that must be communicated for young Africans for them to learn it, because there are still many in the dark who continue to support the imperialists, believing what they say and do. Maybe because they're given something, I'm not sure. But Africa must learn its history. Wake up. This is what we also fight for.
So, why does this matter? Why is one young leader's no making headlines across the world? Because what Captain Ibrahim Traoré just did wasn't only about deportation. It was about dignity. He said no to being used, no to being bullied, and no to a global system that still treats Africa like the world's testing ground. And my people, that no carries weight, because every time an African leader says no and stands firm, it chips away at a system that's built on fear and dependency. Burkina Faso is a small country, no sea, no oil, no massive economy. But in this moment, it became a giant. Because power isn't about size, it's about spine. Now, of course, Traoré will be criticized. Some will call him reckless. Others will say he's isolating his country. But let's be real. What's the alternative? To stay silent? To comply and call it partnership? That's what's gotten us here. Decades of doing what's expected, of signing deals that look good on paper but break us in practice. And yet, here comes a leader who says, no, our land will not be used that way. That's more than defiance. That's leadership. But my people, here's where it gets deep. Because as powerful as Traoré's stand is, he's standing alone. That's the tragedy and the opportunity. Because if the African Union, ECOWAS, or even a coalition of willing nations backed Traoré's stance, the US would have no choice but to negotiate differently. Because when Africa acts collectively, it's not a plea, it's power. And my people, and my hope is that this moment, one small nation standing tall, is the spark that wakes up the rest of the continent. Because the day Africa learns to say no together is the day nobody will ever take advantage of us again. And let's be clear, my people, this is not about refusing partnership with the United States. This is about the type of partnership that's being put on the table by Donald Trump. Because partnership shouldn't look like pressure. It shouldn't sound like take our deportees or lose your visas. That's not collaboration. That's something else. Real partnership is built on mutual respect, not on leverage or fear. It's built on dialogue, not on deals that come with hidden penalties. But what we're seeing right now in Burkina Faso, in the Sahel, and across Africa is a one-sided relationship that's long overdue for a reset. The truth is, Africa doesn't want a fight with America. In fact, most Africans still believe in partnership, in trade, in education, in innovation. They want collaboration, not confrontation. But partnership cannot mean submission, because if it does, then it's not partnership. It's control, dressed up as diplomacy. And what Traoré's government is saying in its own way is simple. We will work with you, but not at the expense of our dignity. And that's a fair demand, isn't it? Because if we're talking about democracy and freedom, then saying no should never be punished. But my people, this is where things get interesting, because while Washington is doubling down on visa bans and deportation deals, Africa is shifting politically, economically, and psychologically. You've got leaders in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger all pushing to reclaim sovereignty, to build new alliances, and to negotiate on their own terms. And whether you agree with their methods or not, they're forcing the world to confront a question that it's avoided for decades. What does an equal partnership with Africa actually look like? Because partnership should never come with threats. It should come with choices, with respect, and with mutual benefit. And that's really what this moment is about. Not rejecting America, not rejecting partners, but rejecting the old version of partnership, where the West decides what's best for Africa, and Africa is expected to just comply, nod along. Those days must be over.
My biggest regret is having spent a good part of my youth listening to radios like RFI, France 24. I've been living in countries where these radios were the only ones. We would use the programs, record their news to listen to, but after a while, there was a click. I began to understand that they brainwash us to accept what they want. It's their narrative they want us to learn, and since then I've become more aware of this, and I've understood that what they do is very dangerous. And today more than ever I realize that they have especially manipulated the minds of Africans. And you can play a significant role in waking young people's consciousness, helping them understand how the world works and preventing them from falling into the trap of those narratives.
So my people, this is bigger than Burkina Faso. Because whether you agree with Ibrahim Traoré or not, what he just did sets an example, a precedence. He reminded the world and the continent that Africa can say no and survive it. That we don't have to accept every deal, every condition, every form of cooperation that comes with a catch. And that's powerful. Because for too long, we've been told that saying no means losing aid, losing access, losing relationships. But maybe, just maybe, saying no is where true independence begins. This is the moment that should make every African nation rethink how we negotiate. Because right now, too many nations are signing deals alone, competing for favor instead of building collective strength. And that's why we keep losing leverage. Imagine if countries like Ghana and South Sudan, Rwanda, instead of cutting separate migration or resource deals, stood together and said, we'll engage, but we'll engage on our terms. And here they are. Suddenly the power dynamics flips. The US or China or Europe can't play one country against another because Africa is speaking with one voice. And that's what Burkina Faso's defiance reveals, how unity turns resistance into strategy. Burkina Faso's stand should not make other African leaders afraid. It should make them reflect. Because this moment proves that political courage still exists on the continent. That we can draw lines, defend them, and define what partnership should look like, not just accept what's handed down. And if more African countries take that same approach, if they stop negotiating from fear and start negotiating from principle, then Africa won't just be reacting to global policy, we'll be setting it. That's why what Traoré did matters, not because of one visa ban or one political statement, but because it forces Africa to ask itself a deeper question. What do we stand for? Because once Africa figures that out, no superpower on earth will ever be able to dictate to us again. So let's be clear, my people, this is not about anti-America, anti-West, or anti-anyone. This is about pro-Africa. It's about a new kind of leadership that says partnership must be built on mutual respect, not manipulation. That friendship doesn't mean obedience. That collaboration doesn't mean control. And if we get this moment right, if more African leaders find the courage to follow their conscience instead of the money, then Burkina Faso's defiance won't just be a headline, but rather a blueprint. A blueprint for a continent that finally moves as one. A continent that doesn't wait for permission to defend its own destiny, Because let's be honest, the world is watching to see if that spark in Ouagadougou catches fire, watching to see if Africa will rise together or fall separately. So here's my question to you, my people. If one small African nation can stand tall, what could 54 do if they stood together? Because that's when everything changes. That's when the aid narrative dies. That's when the dependency narrative ends. That's when the world finally has to deal with Africa not as a beneficiary, but as an equal. And by the way, that benefits the world. But we'll talk about that on another episode.